All right, so now that we have covered the Cold War and a lot of the stuff going on then, now we're going to look at the end of the Cold War and beginning of the modern era, where we look at the rise of conservatism and Ronald Reagan. So we have a rise of conservatism in the 60s and 70s. Conservative presidents included Richard Nixon and Ford. We had many political commentators, free market economists who were pushing conservative ideas. And mainly the conservative platform was being against big government, being against the New Deal, being against gun control, being against feminism, being against gay rights, being against welfare, being against affirmative action, being against sexual permissiveness, being against abortion, being against drug use. They believe that a lot of those issues were undermining family and religious values, and therefore work ethic and ultimately national security. During this time, we have taxpayers basically saying, screw this, we don't want to keep paying taxes. So in 1978, California Proposition 13 sharply cut property taxes. And a major economist of the time, Arthur Laffer, said that tax cuts would increase government revenues. We also have a conservative religious revival during this time with TV religious leaders like Pat Robertson, Oral Roberts, Jim Bakker, who had over 60 to 100 million viewers weekly. They preached against the moral decay happening in the country. Jerry Falwell was the founder of the Moral Majority, which financed campaigns to get rid of liberal members of Congress. They attacked secular humanism, so a focus on individuals, as a godless creed taking over public education. And they campaigned for the return of prayers and the teaching of the biblical account of creation in public schools. There was also a push against the teaching of evolution in public schools again at this time. There was also the Right to Life movement, which united Catholics and fundamentalist Protestants. They believed that human life begins at the moment of conception, and therefore abortion is killing a human soul. So the Supreme Court case Roe versus Wade was a case which legalized abortion in the first 3 months of a woman's pregnancy. At this point in time, it was illegal in many states at any point in a woman's pregnancy to have an abortion. And so you had the problem where a lot of women were having backdoor abortions and unsafe abortions, and they weren't getting done by medical doctors. So it was a matter of safety at this point in time, which is what the Supreme Court ruled. It gave women the right to choose whether or not they wanted an abortion, and it kind of negated the state laws that made it illegal. There was also an elimination of racial preferences at the time. Affirmative action was created under LBJ, or President Johnson, in the 60s to ensure that underprivileged minorities and women would have equal access to education, jobs, and promotions. But in the 1970s, we have recession and stagflation, which led to a lot of whites blaming their troubles on affirmative action, claiming that it was reverse discrimination. In the Supreme Court case of Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, the Supreme Court ruled that while race could be a consideration of the admissions process, the school in question, the University of California, had created racial quotas, saying that they had to have a minimum number of acceptances of African Americans, a minimum number of women, a minimum number of Asians, a minimum number of Hispanics. And those quotas were unconstitutional, according to the Supreme Court. During this time, we also see the deregulation of business, where federal and state governments cut back regulations, they lowered taxes, and they weakened labor unions. A lot of business donors created think tanks, which are these organizations that promote free market ideas. Some examples include the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, and the Cato Institute. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce also lobbied for pro-business legislation. So we're seeing a lot of pro-business decisions during this conservative era. Ronald Reagan. He rose to fame because he first was a well-known movie and TV actor. But then he got involved in politics. He became a very effective political speaker, and he ultimately became the governor of California. In 1976, he also became the party's leading spokesperson for conservative positions. A lot of people saw him as very handsome and vigorous and this great master of the media and public speaking. And he was really seen as a very likable and a sensible champion of the average American. So in the election of 1980, the Republican candidate was Ronald Reagan. Reagan attacked the Democrats for expanding the government and undermining U.S. prestige abroad. We had the Iranian hostage crisis, where American hostages were held in the hands of Iranian radicals. And 51% of the popular vote was won by him, as well as 91% of the electoral vote. As for the Democratic candidate, Carter, who was the current president, most Americans were pretty disappointed with the state of the nation at the end of Carter's first term. And then you also have an independent moderate, John Anderson, who received 8% of the popular vote. The significance of the election of 1980, Reagan took more than 50% of the blue-collar vote, which broke up the New Deal coalition. The Republican control of the Senate for the first time in 1954 was awesome for the Republicans, and Republicans had a working majority with conservative Democrats in the House, which ended a half-century of Democratic dominance of Congress. So the Republicans saw a huge conservative shift during the election of 1980. So it's known as the Reagan Revolution when Reagan took office. The Iranian hostages were ultimately released on January 20th, 1981, which is the same day that President Ronald Reagan took his oath of office. There were 52 American hostages who were released, and it was seen as a very positive start to Reagan's presidency. A good movie to watch about that is Argo. Reagan pledged lower taxes, reducing government spending on welfare, building up the U.S. Armed Forces, and creating a more conservative federal court. His also major push was the economic plan of supply-side economics, also known as Reaganomics. They wanted to create tax cuts and reduce government spending, which would increase investment by the private sector, which would then lead to increased production, jobs, and prosperity. This contrasted with Keynesian economics, which relied on government spending during economic downturns to boost consumer income and demand. Critics compared it to the trickle-down economics of the 1920s, where wealthy Americans prospered and some of their increased spending would benefit the middle class and the poor. There was also federal tax reduction, where the Economic Recovery Act of 1981 saw a 25% decrease in personal income taxes over 3 years. There were cuts in corporate income tax, capital gains tax, and gift and inheritance taxes, where a large share of the tax relief went to upper income taxpayers. Small investors were allowed to invest up to $2,000 per year to individual retirement accounts, or IRAs, without paying taxes on that money. There were also spending cuts where Republicans cut more than $40 billion from domestic programs like food stamps, student loans, and mass transportation. There was a dramatic increase in military spending, but no cuts in Medicare or Social Security, which actually strengthened Social Security during this time. There was also deregulation, so reducing federal regulations on business and industry. Restrictions were eased on savings and loan institutions. Mergers and takeovers were more allowed by large corporations, and environmental protection was backed off. There were decreased regulations on emissions and auto safety to help the struggling American auto industry. And Secretary of the Interior James Watt opened federal lands for increased coal and timber production, as well as offshore waters for oil drilling. Conservatives took a tough stand against unions. They fired thousands of striking federal air traffic controllers for violating their contract, and they decertified their union. Businesses followed Reagan's example and hired striker replacements in labor conflicts. And there was a loss of manufacturing jobs plus anti-union policies, which led to a decline of union membership among non-farm workers. In 1982, we saw the worst recession since 1930s. Banks failed, unemployment reached 11%, and inflation was reduced to less than 4%. The economy was able to rebound with Reaganomics policies, and upper income groups enjoyed higher incomes from a deregulated marketplace. The standard of living for the middle class remained stagnant or declined. It took until the late 1990s for the middle class to gain back some of its losses. As for social issues, Reagan appointed conservative judges to the Supreme Court. Sandra Day O'Connor was the first woman on the Supreme Court, pictured below. Antonin Scalia, Anthony Kennedy, and new Chief Justice William Rehnquist, all of whom were conservative. They scaled back affirmative action in both hiring and promotions, and they limited Roe v. Wade by allowing states to impose certain restrictions on abortions, like requiring minors to notify their parents before having an abortion. We also see states requiring 24-hour grace periods before you can have an abortion, multiple requests, multiple doctor's visits, stuff like that. In the election of 1984, the public had a strong confidence with the recovery return of prosperity for some Americans. Reagan again was the candidate in 1984. He campaigned on an optimistic "It's morning again in America" theme. 2/3 of white males voted for Reagan. The Democrats nominated Walter Mondale, who was Carter's VP, and Geraldine Ferrero ran as his vice president, and she's the first woman to run for vice president on a major party ticket. African Americans and those earning less than $12,500 per year favored Democrats, and Jesse Jackson during this time became the first African American politician to make a strong run for the presidency by seeking the support of all minority groups under the banner of the National Rainbow Coalition. Reagan's tax cuts combined with large increases in military spending, which led to federal deficits of more than $200 billion a year. The national debt tripled from about $900 billion to almost $2.7 trillion. Tax cuts, which were designed to stimulate investments, seemed only to increase consumption, especially of foreign-made luxury and consumer items. The U.S. trade deficit reached $150 billion per year, and we had a cumulative trade imbalance of $1 trillion during the 1980s, which contributed to a dramatic increase in foreign ownership of U.S. real estate and industry. For the first time since World War I, the U.S. had become a debtor nation. The Graham-Redmond-Hollings Balanced Budget Act from Congress provided for across-the-board spending cuts. As for the impact of Reaganomics, there were reduced restrictions on a free market economy, and it put more money in the hands of investors and higher income Americans. It succeeded in containing the growth of the New Deal Great Society welfare state. And it also created huge federal deficits of $200 to $300 billion a year, which changed political debate context. There were no new social programs that seemed to be reasonable, like universal health care, which is something that we're still hearing today. And it changed the debate to which government programs to cut and by how much. As for foreign policy during the Reagan years, the Cold War was kind of renewed with an increase in defense spending and an aid to anti-communist forces in Latin America. As for the military buildup, we spent billions to build new weapons systems like the B-1 bomber and the MX missile, and to expand the U.S. Navy from 450 to 600 ships. We increased spending on the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. It's also called Star Wars, and it was this ambitious plan for building a high-tech system of lasers and particle beams to destroy enemy missiles before they could reach U.S. territory. The defense budget also grew from $171 billion in 1981 to more than $300 billion in 1985. As for what was going on in Central America, Reagan supported friendly right-wing dictators to keep out communism. The enemy is my friend. It's kind of the way he looked at it. So in Nicaragua in 1979, there was a Marxist movement known as the Sandinistas, who overthrew the country's dictator. The U.S. provided significant military aid to the Contras in their effort to dislodge the Sandinistas. In 1985, Democrats opposed to aid passed the Boland Amendment, which prohibited further aid to the Contras. Well, that became an issue later. As for El Salvador, the Reagan administration spent nearly $5 billion to support the Salvadorian government against a coalition of leftist guerrillas. Many Americans protested the killing of more than 40,000 civilians, including American missionaries, by right-wing death squads with connections to the El Salvador army. In Grenada, a coup led to the establishment of a pro-Cuban regime, and in October of 1983, Reagan ordered a small force of Marines to invade the island in order to prevent the establishment of a strategic communist military base in the Americas. The invasion succeeded in reestablishing a pro-U.S. government in Grenada. Grenada, you can see on the map in orange, the second island above South America. The Iran-Contra Affair. This is where we get a little messy. In 1980, Iran and Iraq engaged in a bloody war. Reagan aides kept a secret plan from the American people of selling U.S. anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles to Iran's government for its help in freeing the Americans who were held hostage by a radical Arab group. So remember, that's the Iran hostage crisis. In 1986, another Reagan staff member had the idea to use the profits of the arms deal with Iran to fund those Contras over in Nicaragua, after the Democrats had already voted, no, you can't do that. So Reagan denied that he had any knowledge of this illegal diversion of funds, again, because it violated the Boland Amendment and congressional budget authority. Congress decides where money gets paid. The image for the public was that an uninformed, hands-off president was easily manipulated by his advisors. So I know it gets kind of confusing, like how all of this is connected. If you look at this map, we sold guns to Iran in the Middle East, and then the money from the profits of selling those guns was sent over to the Contras, causing issues. In 1982, Israel, with U.S. approval, invaded southern Lebanon to stop the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO, terrorists from raiding Israel. The U.S. sent peacekeeping forces into Lebanon in an effort to contain Lebanon's civil war. In April of 1983, an Arab suicide squad bombed the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, killing 63 people. Fun fact, my dad was there, and it just so happened my father-in-law was there too, as they were both in the Navy at that point in time. In 1983, an Arab terrorist drove a bomb-filled truck into the U.S. Marines barrack in Beirut, killing 241 servicemen as well. In 1984, Reagan ultimately pulled U.S. forces out of Lebanon. The Secretary of State, George Shultz, pushed for a peaceful settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict by setting up a homeland for the PLO in the West Bank territories, which had been occupied by Israel since the 1967 war. Yasser Arafat, the PLO leader, pictured on the right, agreed in 1988 to recognize Israel's right to exist as a nation. We also have improved U.S.-Soviet relations. In the early 80s, the Cold War intensified due to Reagan's arms buildup, and the Soviets also deployed a larger number of missiles against NATO countries. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the new Soviet leader. He attempted to change Soviet domestic policies by introducing two major reforms, Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost is openness, to end political repression and move toward greater political freedom for Soviet citizens. Perestroika is the restructuring of the Soviet economy. In 1987, Reagan challenged Gorbachev to follow through with his reforms in front of the Brandenburg Gate and the Berlin Wall by saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." So in 1987, Gorbachev and Reagan agreed to remove and destroy all intermediate range missiles, the INF agreement. And in 1988, Gorbachev started the pullout of troops from Afghanistan and cooperated with the U.S. in putting diplomatic pressure on Iran and Iraq to end their war.